There is a quiet war being waged, not one fought with swords or fire, but with whispers, temptations, and slow creeping influence. It is not always the loud and obvious evils that undo a soul. Rather, it is the subtle invitations, the overlooked objects, and the tolerated habits that open the door to darkness. A man does not fall into ruin in a single moment. No, it happens by degrees, by allowing small compromises, by entertaining things that dull the spirit and cloud the mind. There are things we hold on to, sometimes out of sentimentality, sometimes out of ignorance, but they act as conduits, drawing in the very forces that seek to weaken and destroy. What are these things? They could be objects linked to unclean practices, charms that promise power, books that distort truth, or media that glorifies what is vile. They could be habits, dwelling in bitterness, nurturing envy, or indulging in entertainment that erodes virtue rather than strengthens it. A person who surrounds themselves with these things, even unknowingly, is like a man who builds his home with rotten wood. Sooner or later, collapse is inevitable. We must take inventory of our lives. Walk through your home, your mind, and your habits as if inspecting the walls of a fortress. If you find anything that weakens your resolve, distorts your clarity, or invites influences that drain your peace, remove it immediately, for what you tolerate today may rule you tomorrow. Strength is found in discipline. A man who locks his door at night does not do so out of fear, but out of wisdom. In the same way, let us secure our minds and spirits, keeping only what elevates, strengthens, and aligns with what is truly good. The question is not whether you are strong enough to resist corruption, but whether you are wise enough to refuse its entry in the first place. Choose now. Cast out what diminishes you, and make room for what builds you into something greater. In the grand scheme of life, the greatest battles are not fought on fields of war, but within the quiet chambers of the human mind and soul. We often believe that danger comes in the form of something obvious, an immediate and recognizable threat. Yet history, philosophy, and experience teach us that the most perilous influences are often subtle, creeping in unnoticed, gaining ground inch by inch until they have taken control. Consider the nature of corruption. A mighty structure does not collapse in a day. A great ship does not sink from a single drop of water. No, the decay begins imperceptibly. A small crack in the foundation, a tiny leak that is ignored, a whisper instead of a shout. It is in these unnoticed moments that the greatest danger lies, for what seems insignificant today may, in time, become a force too great to resist. Many people invite unseen forces into their lives without realizing it, simply by the things they entertain, the objects they cherish, and the habits they refuse to question. It is an unspoken law of the universe that what we surround ourselves with, what we gaze upon, what we read, and what we listen to has an effect upon us, shaping us in ways we may not immediately perceive. A man who sits too long in the company of bitterness will soon find himself embittered. A woman who indulges too frequently in distractions that glorify cruelty or deception will, in time, find her heart hardened. Objects are not always lifeless. A book is not merely ink on a page. It is a vessel for ideas, a carrier of influence. Music is not merely sound, it carries with it emotion, intent, and spirit. An artifact from a place or practice steeped in deception does not merely sit idle. It carries with it a history, a weight, an unseen chain that binds those who possess it. The ancients understood this well. They recognized that certain objects carried with them an energy that could not be ignored, and so they spoke of purification, of removing what was unclean, not as superstition, but as a necessary guard against unseen dangers. We live in an age that dismisses such things as myths, yet the consequences remain the same. A mind saturated with ideas that distort truth will in time find itself unable to distinguish between light and darkness. A home that houses things tied to destruction, deception, or despair will find its atmosphere subtly altered. The soul, though unseen, is deeply sensitive to the things around it. If a man surrounds himself with books that glorify deception, he should not be surprised when deception begins to feel like wisdom. If a woman decorates her space with objects linked to despair and chaos, she should not wonder why her heart feels burdened. This is not to say that every object or every book holds a demonic force waiting to strike. That is too simplistic a view. Rather, it is the slow, steady shaping of the mind and spirit that must be considered. A person does not become lost in an instant, but through a series of small, almost imperceptible choices. The danger is not in one moment of exposure, but in the gradual acceptance, the quiet tolerance, the belief that it is just a book, just a song, just a decoration. But what is just anything? A drop of poison in a cup may seem insignificant, but in time it spreads. A single lie, told often enough, becomes indistinguishable from truth. In the same way, the influences we allow into our lives begin as something small, but grow into something profound. The great enemy of the soul does not come shouting at the gates, but whispers at the threshold, waiting to be welcomed in, under the guise of something harmless. The wise understand this and take action. They do not live in fear, but in awareness. They examine what they allow into their homes, what they consume, what they hold on to, because they recognize that not everything is as innocent as it seems. There are things that darken the mind, weaken the will, and invite unseen forces that thrive on confusion and despair. To be wise is to recognize this before the damage is done. So, what must be done? First, one must awaken to the reality that influences matter. There must be an honest examination of what is being permitted in the heart and home. Then, there must be action, the removal of anything that serves as a silent weight on the soul. This is not about superstition, but about discipline, about guarding what is sacred, about understanding that what is tolerated today will shape the person you become tomorrow. A person who values their physical health does not stock their home with poison. A person who values their spiritual and mental clarity must do the same. It is not weakness to remove what is harmful, it is wisdom. It is not fear to guard against the subtle forces that seek to manipulate and distort. It is the mark of one who understands the cost of negligence. Each day, choices are made. The question is not whether influences will shape you, but which ones you will allow. The mind and soul are like fertile soil. Whatever is planted will grow. Choose wisely what you cultivate, for the harvest is inevitable. A wise person does not leave the doors of their home unlocked at night, not because they live in fear, but because they understand the nature of danger. It does not always announce itself with a loud crash, but often enters quietly, slipping through an open door left unguarded. In the same way, the influences we allow into our lives, the objects we keep, the ideas we entertain, and the habits we nurture act as doors. Some leading to strength and clarity, others inviting confusion and darkness. The mind is a fortress, but it is only as strong as its defenses. There are forces in this world that seek to weaken, distort, and corrupt. not through sudden and obvious attacks, but through slow erosion. The things we tolerate, the habits we excuse, and the influences we consider harmless can, over time, reshape our very thoughts and desires, just as a stream of water can carve through stone over years. Small and seemingly insignificant things can wear away at wisdom, resolve, and virtue, until one day, a person finds themselves in a place they never intended to be. There is nothing passive about guarding the mind and soul. It requires vigilance, a willingness to examine what is being let in, and the courage to remove anything that threatens one's integrity. Many people assume they are immune to the slow drift of influence. They believe they can entertain destructive ideas without being affected, that they can surround themselves with things that glorify deception, violence, or despair without consequence. But no one is beyond influence. The strongest walls will crumble if cracks are ignored, and the wisest mind will become clouded if it allows itself to be filled with distractions that weaken its clarity. A person who allows negativity, confusion, and harmful influences into their mind is like a homeowner who invites thieves into their house, believing they can control them once they enter. But corruption does not ask for permission. It does not need an invitation. It only needs an opportunity. And once it finds a foothold, it spreads. The only true safeguard is to be ruthless in removing what does not serve the greater good of the soul. One of the most dangerous things a person can do is believe that small compromises do not matter. They may think that a single book, a single object, or a single habit cannot truly influence them. But what is a house if not the sum of its bricks? What is a person if not the accumulation of their choices? The habits of today shape the character of tomorrow. The things that fill a person's home and mind will determine the atmosphere they live in. There is no such thing as a neutral influence. Everything either strengthens or weakens, builds up or erodes. Imagine a person who spends their days consuming messages that glorify what is deceitful, self-serving, or hopeless. They may not notice the change at first, but over time their thoughts will begin to reflect what they have been feeding their mind. They will become cynical where they were once hopeful, careless where they were once careful, and indifferent where they were once principled. This transformation does not happen all at once, but slowly, subtly, as each tolerated influence shapes their thinking. Now, contrast this with someone who deliberately surrounds themselves with things that uplift, strengthen, and clarify. This person does not tolerate the presence of things that distort truth or weaken their resolve. They take inventory of their life, removing anything that drags them toward confusion and doubt. Such a person is not only guarded but also free. Free from the silent weight of distractions, free from the burden of unchecked influence, free to build a mind and spirit that can stand against the pressures of the world. This is why discernment is critical. A person must train themselves to recognize what is beneficial and what is harmful, not only in the obvious sense, but in the subtle ways that influence creeps in. If something leads the mind toward doubt, despair, or deception, it has no place in a home that seeks wisdom. If something weakens the will to choose what is right, it should not be entertained. If an object carries with it an energy or association that darkens the spirit, it must be removed without hesitation. There is great strength in discipline. The ability to say no to what is harmful, to walk away from what does not serve a higher purpose, is not a sign of restriction, but of wisdom. Just as a warrior trains to keep their body strong, a person must train their mind and soul to remain sharp and focused. This is not done by allowing all things without discretion, but by choosing carefully, protecting what is valuable and removing what threatens to erode the foundation of truth and clarity. The greatest mistake a person can make is believing that they are too strong to be affected. No one is beyond the reach of influence. The wise do not test their limits by exposing themselves to corruption, they avoid it entirely. They understand that it is easier to maintain strength than to rebuild it after it has been lost. They recognize that every decision, every object, and every habit contributes to the life they are building. To guard the mind and soul is to take responsibility for what is allowed to enter. It is to understand that what is tolerated today will shape tomorrow. It is to acknowledge that not everything is worth keeping, that some things, no matter how sentimental, entertaining, or seemingly harmless, must be removed for the sake of something greater. In the end, the choice is always ours. We can choose to let anything and everything shape us, or we can take control, casting out what does not belong, securing what is valuable, and building a life that is strong, clear, and unshaken by the subtle influences that seek to pull us away from the truth.